It's my pleasure, Dave. Thank you and the rest of the International Podcast Day team for putting this thing together. So I just take 10 seconds to introduce myself in case you're just joining. My name is Yann Ilunga. As Dave said, I'm joining you from Helsinki, Finland. Really, really excited about this. And I'm originally from Switzerland. So Kelly, you did make me miss home a bit with the with the cocoa and chocolate. And as Dave said, I thought that in this session, we could talk about podcasts as a business asset. And this session, as I said, there's been so many great, inspiring sessions before this one. And certain things we're going to cover, Kelly touched on those in her session. I don't want you to get mistaken if maybe you don't have a business podcast and you're like, oh, well, okay, so this isn't for me. This is going to be for you anyways, because I'm going to share some golden nuggets that you can definitely start to utilize for your podcast, regardless of whether you have a business podcast or not. And before we dive into the content, I want to ask you guys to join me and give Steve, Dave, and the International Podcast Day team a shout out. So I crafted an automated tweet that you can tweet. So join me. You find the link here in the chat, this bit.ly link. So I'm just going to give you a couple of seconds. Make sure to share that and give International Podcast Day a huge shout out because I think it's well deserved. You're very welcome, Dave. And don't hesitate if you, throughout the presentation, if you have questions, leave them in the chat. I'll definitely keep an eye there and I'm going to be answering those. So I'm curious because this session is going to be two-folded. So there's going to be a part and then a second part. And I'm curious, of all of you who are joining me here, I know that I assume many of you are podcasters, but how many of you are also podcast guests? So sometimes you go on somebody else's podcast and you're being interviewed. Just let me know in the chat. Just write me or type Y or a smiley face. Okay, I see Will Sinclair says never yet. So sounds like something you may be doing very soon. I see Max Flight says an occasional guest. Okay, only a few times, says Dave. Okay, so we do have some people who are thinking about it. And this session is also going to help you maximize your efforts if you decide that you also want to be on podcasts as a guest. So in the first part, we're going to talk about podcasts as a business asset from the host point of view. And it drives me crazy because I'm a podcaster. So I'm the host of two different shows, one in the entrepreneurial space called 360 Entrepreneur, one in the music business called the Jazz Spotlight. And in a few weeks, I'm going to be launching two new shows. And I'm also a podcasting consultant. So I work with entrepreneurs, coaches, authors, marketers who want to unlock the power of podcasting, whether it's as a guest, as a host, or as both. And it drives me crazy when I'm approached by somebody who has a podcast and says, well, okay, Jan, I want to make money on my podcast. And I'm like, so what are you thinking of doing to achieve that goal? And they're like, well, yeah, I'm just gonna get a lot of downloads and then I'm gonna get sponsors. And I'm like, all right, take a second. Let's take a step back. The first question you should ask yourself is, why am I podcasting? And this is a very, very important question you should ask yourself. Is it because you want to build authority? So you want to share, hi Magda, you want to share your message with the world and you want to position yourself as an expert. Or perhaps you want to network. So maybe you are like me in a different side of the world and you would like to network with people who are in a specific area or who cover a specific topic or who are in a specific niche. That can be the case. Or perhaps you want to leverage your podcast because you would like to get more people on your email list. Hi, Kelly, thanks. Or on your Facebook community. That can be the case. And if you see me looking here, it's because I took some notes. So think about a couple of things I just mentioned. Why do you want to podcast? Is it to network, to build authority, to build a community, to grow your email list, or maybe to raise awareness about your business, about your book, about your course, about your coaching career, whatever it is that you do? And the reason why it is important to ask yourself this question is that once you are clear on what your number one goal is, you can take concrete steps. Okay, I see Will says, for example, to share my story and help others. That's great. And by the way, I'm going to touch on this in a second, but it's not that if you think, okay, my number one reason for starting a podcast is, for example, like Will says, to share my story, it means that it's going to be like that forever. At some point, you're going to start to feel comfortable being a podcaster, and perhaps you're going to shift a bit. You're like, okay, I'm clear with how the podcasting technology side of things works. I've been starting to build a community now. I want to shift the focus a bit, and I'm gonna try to be featured on podcasts. So I want to use my podcast to position myself as an expert. So there are certain things you're gonna do. So the first thing is definitely the why. Once you are clear with the why, every single thing you do for your podcast should be very intentional. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that every single word out of your mouth should be scripted, for example, or that you shouldn't have any freedom, because I'm a firm believer in three things when it comes to trying anything. And I thought I mentioned those, or I refer to those lovely as the 3 T's. So for anything I try to do when I get to learn something new, whether it's on International Podcast Day, on a podcast, on a book, a video course I attend, I do 3 things. I test the advice for myself, because everybody is different, everybody's in a different situation. I test, I keep track of the stats, and then the third thing is tweak. So if once I test, once I track the stats, and then I have some results, I can tweak or move on if necessary. So it's important to keep those in mind. Now, I said about being intentional, and that goes into a few things. First of all, obviously, the way your podcast is hosted. Okay, that's very, very important. And what I mean by this is that by no means I'm trying to tell you to be somebody else but yourself. Absolutely not. You should be yourself. But at the same time, you should keep the number one goal you have at the back of your mind. So, for example, if your goal, let's say you have a Facebook group and you would like to get people into your Facebook group, because podcasting is a personal experience. Everybody is listening to your show by himself or herself. So you would like to build a common space to bring those people together and form a community. Great. If that's your number one goal, when you have a podcast episode that you release, you should keep that in mind, and you should make sure that you give listeners a reminder about the community, or you give them an incentive to join your community. So the best way to do that is to have a call to action at the end of your episode. And sometimes it's interesting because we tend to want to do everything at the same time. So we may ask people to subscribe to our show, leave us a review, join the Facebook community, follow us on Twitter, and then make sure to let your friends know about it. And don't forget to leave a comment in the podcast show notes. If that's you, I want to help you kind of overcome that challenge with a simple thing. Ask yourself, how do you listen to podcasts? Are you all the time in front of your computer, or perhaps you have headphones and you're out for a walk, or you're at the gym, or you're cooking? Oftentimes, people may multitask when they are listening to podcasts. So what this means is that if we give them 5 or 6 different options, nobody's going to remember that. However, if we have one clear call to action and we say, okay, we have covered a lot, and it's been a fantastic episode, and if you want to ask more questions, if you want to connect with me, blah, 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 go to, and you mention a link that is easy to remember. Okay, it's easy to remember. So if I were to do that, if this was a podcast I would be recording, I'd say something like, if you want to join the community, make sure to go to yannilunga.com/community. So it's important that your link is easy to remember, because if I say, make sure to go to yannilunga.com/join-the-Facebook-community-now, Nobody's going to remember that. And the way you can create links that are easy for people to remember if you're using WordPress is a plugin called Pretty Link. So it's free, and what that does, it allows you to create links that are easy for people to remember. So that's one option. If your goal is to grow your email list, then we still have one call to action, but we have to think about it. Okay, Kelly, I see you use Pretty Link, great. But we have to keep in mind that people, as I said, sometimes they do other things when they listen to a podcast. So for us to have them join our newsletter, we have to give them a reason that pushes people to join, not tomorrow, not next week, but right now, that potentially it makes them take a few second break from what they are doing to go and sign up for your newsletter. So if you are in the States, for example, in North America, you could do this by using SMS marketing. So instead of mentioning a specific link, you would say to people, text the word Yann to 12345, for example. If you're on the other side, on different countries, those kind of services aren't available yet. Like in my case, for example, I haven't heard of that in Finland. So in that case, the best way to invite people to join, you say, Kelly, lead pages. To invite people onto our email list, in that case, the best way to do that is to invite them to the show notes page. So the show notes page is the page where we link to the resources that came up during the interview. If we do an interview-based show, we link to the guest's site and these kind of things. But there is one thing. Remember, I said on the podcast, you need to have one call to action. And for your show notes, obviously, you're going to have different things. You're going to be a list of links and these kind of things. But still, your one call to action, visually speaking, should stand out. So, for example, for having people join our newsletter, what we could do is we could create a graphic or a button that really stands out, so that when somebody goes to the show notes page, they see it immediately and then can join in. So those are a couple of things that you should keep in mind and kind of start to change the mindset a little bit if you really want to leverage podcasts as a host, as a business asset. Now, I talked about the show notes. I touched on the email list growth a little bit. I want to add a piece of advice when it comes to list building. On podcasts, you should leverage the fact that podcasts are an audio-only medium. So what that means is that for you should give people help that allows them to understand certain concepts on a more visual term. And here's what I mean. Let's say if you have a podcast about photography, for example, and you have an episode where you talk about, I don't know, different camera lenses or how to position your camera to take pictures of sunsets, for example. To explain the concept audio only, it can be a bit technical, a bit complicated. So what you could create as a downloadable lead magnet could be a simple image where you take an image of the camera setup, or you make a short video where it's you setting up your camera and you explain to people, okay, the tripod goes here, make sure that the camera is positioned this way. So what that allows you to do is to leverage the fact that podcasts are an audio-only medium, and for your listeners, allows them to take the next step. So whenever you're thinking about growing your list and using your podcast as a host to grow your list, you should think, okay, what is the next step I would like my listeners to take? And if it's to join your email list, great. But if you simply say, sign up for my newsletter, that's not very compelling. On the other hand, if you create a resource, and the guys over at Lead Pages, they do this very well with their podcast Conversion Cast, where they have a downloadable resource for every episode, which is kind of the next step to the conversation. And this doesn't have to be a 200-page long ebook. As I said, it can be a simple image. It can be a checklist, or if, for example, you mention many different resources, it could be as simple as gathering all those resources in a PDF and make that available so that for people it's easier because they can access everything from one spot. Now you could say, well, Yann, okay, but you mentioned lead pages, conversion cast, they create one lead magnet for every episode, but I'm podcasting by myself. I don't have a team behind me. So that sounds like a lot of work. What can I do? Well, in this case, or if that's the case, I want you to take a moment and think, okay, what is the topic of my podcast? What are some of the things that we talk about? And then create a couple of lead magnets that revolve around those specific topics. So for example, let's leave photography aside because I don't know much about that. And let's talk about blogging. If you have a podcast about blogging, for example, there are so many areas that go within or under the blogging umbrella, right? There is the setting up a blog aspect. There is how to come up with content aspect. There is how to create that content. So once I came up with the idea or I found an interesting topic, how do I actually go about creating that? The next step is okay, I've written my article. How do I go about promoting it? So you see, I already mentioned 3, 4, 5 different areas or topics that if your podcast is about blogging, your show may touch on. So in that case, you could take a moment to create a lead magnet for each of these subtopics so that when you have an episode that is more about the logistic side of a blog, so building a blog or things like that, you have the lead magnet to mention. If on the other hand you have an episode that is more about the marketing side, then you have a lead magnet. So in that case, you would spend one time, or you would put in the work at the beginning, and then you would have a few lead magnets that you can shift throughout your podcast. Now, I'm going to take a quick sip of water, and I'm curious, do you have any questions so far on this hosting a podcast side of the conversation? Let me know. I'm curious. Is there something that resonates with you? Did you get some ideas by listening to this first part of the session? Great, Will. Great to hear that you're taking some notes. That's great. And okay, so I touched on the call to actions, and as I said earlier, by the way, if you have any questions, comments, kudos, whatever, feel free to leave them in the chat, because as you can see, I really look around. Growing an email list, always difficult. Yeah, you're right, Dave. It's difficult. It is difficult, and what we have to keep in mind is that podcasting is a marathon and not a sprint. And so is list building or building awareness around your product or sharing your message with the world. It's really a marathon. It's really a process. And that's why early on I talked about experimentation. That's something you shouldn't be afraid of doing. Building a tribe, loyal listeners. Yeah, Ray, do you mind elaborating more on that? You mean how to build a tribe and loyal listeners? Okay, so how do we build a tribe? What I think is the best way to go about this, and there isn't any secret formula, but ties into what I said early on. If you think about it, podcasting or listening to podcasts is a very personal experience. So if you start to create a space where your community or your audience members can become part of a community, that's the first step. The second thing is to really make sure that you give back to your community. And here's what I mean. If you're starting out and you may think, well, okay, I have a small show. First of all, there aren't small shows, in my opinion. Every show matters. You may think, well, okay, I have only 20 people listening to my podcast. You know what? When is the last time that you were in a hallway or on stage or at your office and you had 20 people there who were like, okay, tell me, I'm curious to listen to what you have to say. I don't know about you, but I don't mind. So stop looking at the downloads as numbers and start to look at those as people. Now, the next step, once you really change mindset there and ties into your question, Ray, is what can we do to make people feel acknowledged, make them feel part of our community, put the spotlight on them? Well, there are a bunch of things we can do. First of all, we can start to, whenever somebody leaves a comment or sends an email, tweets our podcast, we get an iTunes review, anything like that, let's put the spotlight on them. That's the very first step. Let's start to acknowledge members of our community. Do we have somebody who's really a die-hard fan? Let's surprise them. Let's send them an email to say thank you. Let's record a quick video and let's give them a shout out. Do you have a member of your community, Ray, who has a podcast, and maybe you've checked out that podcast and they are on your Facebook group? You know what? Why don't you take a second to record a 30-second long video to give this person shout out and exposure to her show or his show, and simply say, hey guys, you know me, I'm a podcaster. I love listening to new podcasts, and I just found out about Ray's podcast. You definitely should check it out for these reasons. The link is below the video. What do you think is going to happen, Ray, if something like that happens in a Facebook group? Now, what do you think is going to happen if that is something that comes up on your show every now and then? People are going to be like, what? I just got mentioned on Ray's podcast. I'm going to retweet this and share this with every single person I know. So think about that, and think about creating a space where you take individual listeners, you bring them together to form a community. And then from there, don't focus only on yourself. Okay, I want to get reviews, I want to get downloads, blah, blah, blah. No, think about some of the things you can do to really make every single person feel like he or she is not just a passive member of the community, but he and she are people who are really the backbone of your community, are people that you ask questions to. And if they answer, you acknowledge them. And sometimes you surprise them. They didn't expect at all a shout out. Somebody gives you an iTunes review, gives them a shout out, mention that on your show without expecting anything in return. Think about it. How cool is it if, for example, you listen to a podcast and suddenly your hometown is mentioned, or your favorite movie comes up, and it's not really something you expected, or maybe your name comes up, or the name of your favorite artist or author or athlete comes up. You're like, whoa, okay, it's kind of it's an awakening. Or what do you think, guys? All right, I see Will says, loving this. I see Ray says, yeah, I want the same. Awesome. Okay, so this is one part. Now, there is the monetary aspect of, podcasting, because if you have a business and you want to use your podcast as a business asset, there is the monetary component. Now, the number one mistake, I say new podcasters. Awesome, Dave. Yeah. And actually one thing that I forgot, and also don't be afraid, if you want to expand your community, go beyond your ecosystem, go beyond your podcast. So for example, if audio is something you feel very comfortable with, don't be afraid to start leveraging audio on other platforms. So you could use something like Anchor, for example. I think is anchor.fm, is an app that you can use to record 2-minute long audio snippets. So there you can share your thoughts, you can give props, you can educate people, you can inspire them, you can rant, really, whatever you want to do. Anchor is an option. If you would like to let people know what's happening behind the scenes, so when you're not on the air, when you're not in front of the microphone, something like Instagram stories, Snapchat could be a fantastic way to go about it. Some food for thoughts. Would you like to make your community feel even more part of the conversation and you're hosting a pre-recorded show? Why not inviting them and you say, okay, guys, nowadays, tomorrow I'm going to interview Dave Lee of International Podcast Day. If you have any questions, I'm going to do something a bit different here. You know me, usually I record an interview, I publish it, but tomorrow I want to give you access to Dave and to our conversation. So make sure to join the Facebook group because I'll be live streaming the conversation with Dave there. And if you have questions, we're going to answer your questions. So think about doing something like this really makes people feel part of the whole creative process rather than being simple passive listeners who are like, well, okay, I'm here. I'm listening to Ray's podcast or I'm listening to Wheels and well, okay. No, if we find ways to get them engaged, we get them part of the whole process. That goes a long way. And mind you, when I talk about Instagram stories or Snapchat and those kind of things, you shouldn't worry because maybe you see influencers doing all these things and you're like, well, I don't have anything interesting to say. You do. And people, if somebody is interested in you when you're on the air, they are definitely interested to learn more about you as a person. So, okay, what happens when you're not recording? Or what happens when you're about to record? Or you're preparing for a podcast episode? What do? Do you set up your webcam? Do you set up your microphone? And I've seen Brian Fanzo. I interviewed him for a virtual summit I hosted months ago called Podcast Success Summit. And he did a fantastic job in that the interview for the summit was pre-recorded. But he asked me, is it okay if I set up a couple of phones so that I also live stream it on Periscope? And I think it was maybe Facebook Live. It's like the deleted part of a film, blah, blah, blah. Exactly, Ray. You're right on the money. Think that's a great example. Think, why are those things added on DVDs? Why? Because they're fun. Because even though you may have a business podcast. I host business podcasts, but you know what? I'm having a great time doing that, and I'm not super formal. I'm on the air the same way I'm off the air. So if I make a mistake, I may edit that out. But if I wanted to have people have a good time, I could create a highlight reel of the bloopers or something like that. So think about these things. And when it comes to the monetary aspect of podcasting, think about the first point we touched on, which was, why are you podcasting? So if you think, okay, I'm podcasting because I would like to increase the sales of my book. Great. That can be a goal. But here's the thing. You've heard this 1,000 times, but it's true. People buy from people they know, like, and trust. And Kelly touched upon this in her previous session. If you think that somebody goes from a simple listener to a buyer, you're dead wrong, because that may happen, but that is the exception. It's not the routine. So what you should do is, okay, I want to make money from my podcast. You should focus not on downloads and sponsorships, because those are things you have no control on whatsoever. But you should focus on what you can control. So look at your business. What do you have to sell? If it's a book, like the example I made, great. The next step is, I have somebody listening to my podcast. He or she may be a first-time listener, so they don't know much about me, or they can be diehard fans who have been with me for months. What is the next step I want them to take? Well, if you want to sell, the next step should be, okay, providing additional value for free and letting people know more about you, providing them with more information, having them trust you. So a way you could do this is invite people to join your email list, and you could set up iFunnel. So Kelly talked about this a bit in her session. If you want to start to set up things so that it's kind of a set it and forgetting kind of system, so that you have a system in place, you would need 3 components. You would need, at the end of the funnel, your premium offer. So it can be anything. It can be your book. It can be having a coaching client. It can be hiring you as a speaker. It can be join your membership site, whatever it is. The next step, approaching the entry level of the funnel, is an email sequence that can be automated. And in that sequence, your goal should be not to just bombard people with your product, but it should be provide them with additional value. So build on some of the things you talked about earlier. Go more in depth, provide additional value, share more about who you are and why you do what you do. And then if you have an email sequence, let's say of 5 emails, your first 4 emails should be all about the know, like, and trust factor. And then your 5th email could be, okay, over the last few days, we talked about such and such. If we stick with the blogging example, and let's say you have a membership site about blogging, if over the course of your email sequence, you share some blogging tips, in your final email, you could say, okay, over the last few days, we talked about this. We kind of scratch the surface. If you want to dive deeper into the topic, I have the resource for you. And you can also add urgency to that. So you could create an exclusive bonus or something like that gives people an incentive to buy right there and then. And at the wider level of our funnel, so the entry level of our funnel, we have how often should send this automated email? Will, I'll answer that question in a second. Just give me 1 second, I'll get back to that. So, and at the entry level of our funnel, we have our freebie. So if you think about all this, it all ties in together, because early on I told you, if you want to grow your email list, blah, 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 and I talked about the freebie, the lead magnet, the resource you offer people in exchange for their name and email address. So to recap, at the entry level, we have a free resource, and that's the thing we should be promoting. So if at the end of our funnel, we have our course on blogging, on the podcast, we should invite people to get a free resource that provides them with help right now. So as I said earlier, it can be a checklist, it could be an infographic, it could be a quick video. And when people do sign up for that, we have an email sequence that we set up that automatically is going to deliver them or provide them with value. So the cool thing about this is, regardless of where you are in the world, you won't have to manually greet everybody who joins your email list, invite them to, give you thoughts or provide them with value. No, you set it automatically. Now, Will, you ask how often we should send out these automated emails. And that depends really. And it depends because there are different ways to go about this. For example, if you, what do you use to create email sequence? I use a tool called Active Campaign. So it's Active Campaign. And basically to answer, awesome, Larry. Actually, okay, you know what, guys? I'm going to take a sip of water and I'm going to ask you for a quick favor, a small favor. If you're enjoying this session, if you're enjoying International Podcast Day in general, do you mind clicking this link in the chat? And that's another tweet I pre-wrote for you. And just share it with your community. If you think there may be somebody who could benefit from me ranting here on International Podcast Day, please take a second to just click that link and an automated tweet will come up. Thank you, Larry. And I'm going to just grab a sip of water. And thank you, Ray. And what do you guys think so far? Right? Has it been fun so far, this session? Has it been useful? Okay, I see Ray saying, love it. Great. That's exactly the type of feedback I like. It's been all sorts of, is it really water? You busted me. No, it's actually vodka. I'm in Finland and it's cold here. No, like always, very informative. Thank you, Magna. No, okay. So to answer, there was any question and there was Will's question. So basically when it comes to crafting thanks, Ray. When it comes to crafting the automated email sequence, there are a couple of ways to go about it. So my advice is, let's stick with the blogging example. If we have the blogging course at the end of the funnel, and we have a PDF checklist at the entry level of our funnel. So that's what people are going to get when they sign up for our newsletter. In that case, I would create an email sequence, and there isn't any right number. I would create an email sequence that provides people with additional tips over a window of time of a few days. So for example, it could be every day for the next 5 days. It could be every day for the next 7 days. Here's the thing. If your lead magnet is a PDF and you email people every day for the next 20 days, people are going to be super annoyed at you. So don't do that. think about it. You have to reverse engineer. So think about, you have your course, your premium offer, and you have the freebie. And it's like, what is the next step? So think about that. Somebody has downloaded the checklist. What is the next step you would like them to take? What is the next piece of advice you can provide them with? And share that in your first email. And then think about, okay, now they've gotten step number 1 or advice number 1. What is the next piece of advice that I can give them that ideally builds on the first email's advice, and so forth? So this, as I said, can be 4 emails, 5 emails. And the important thing is that you really put in the effort to provide them with additional value and work on that know, like, and trust factor. And then you make your offer at the end of the email sequence. Now, there is another alternative I'm going to offer to you guys, and it's going to change things a little bit. And that's to change the model a little bit. And instead of having a lead magnet, an email sequence, and then the premium offer, we take our lead magnet, we take the email sequence, and we combine them. And a couple of examples of this could be an email course, or it could be a challenge. So it could be for the blogging, it could be, I don't know, take the 30-day blogging challenge and go from no blog to blog in 30 days. In that case, if we frame it as an email course, as a 10-day email course, or as a 30-day challenge, and we say in our landing page, we say, join this 30-day challenge and get exclusive tips delivered to your inbox every day, people know that they're going to hear from you every single day. Now, what that does, and I personally have signed up for email lists that they had a challenge or an email course that in some cases was literally 30 days. So for an entire month, I would get an email every day. Morning, Christopher. I would get an email from the person every single day. And what using this kind of lead magnet does is that it puts people, or allows you to become part of a person routine. So basically, people are going to get used to get an email from Larry, or get an email from Ray, from Will, from Magda, from Christopher, from Dave. They're going to know, well, okay, so it's a 30-day course or a 10-day challenge. So I know that every day I'm going to get an email from Larry, from Ray, from Will. And guess what? They're going to open it. And not only that, but they're going to follow the steps you would like them to do. So if it's a blogging challenge, it's like, okay, in the first day, you explain, I don't know, how to choose a domain name. And at the end, so you explain, and at the end of your email, you could have, okay, today's action step is to do this. So I don't know, go to bluehost.com and buy a domain name, for example. And you want to create something that provides people with quick wins and help them every single day if you go with a challenge like this. So it's some food for thoughts. I know it can sound a bit overwhelming because it's a lot of ideas, but I really want to make sure, guys, that I provide you with as much value as possible, and I give you some ideas, and then you test one out, the one you think would be best for you, for your community, for the people you're trying to reach. I see there are fire extinguisher, so I'm just gonna get a sip of water. Okay, guys, so I see that I still have a few minutes here to go. And do you have other questions related to podcasting as a host and kind of podcast as a business asset for podcasters? Or otherwise, I'm going to shift the conversation a bit and talk about podcasting from the guest perspective. Yeah, Christopher, you know me, I try. How do I find your podcasts? Don't worry, Will. I'm gonna wrap up with a call to action. So I'm gonna put in practice what I've been preaching here. So I'm gonna leave a bit of suspense, and I'm gonna definitely mention that. But there is one thing, guys, I want to add before I shift toward looking at podcasts as a guest, and it's this: if you have an interview-based show, I want you to start look at the people you interview with a completely different mindset. Stop chasing people just to have them as interviewees and say, oh, okay, I've interviewed this person, that person. Start to think about number one, who are the people who would provide value to your community, number one. And number two, while you're doing the interview, really pay attention to the people, really pay attention to your interaction. And if you interview somebody and you feel that you guys really clicked, look at the entire relationship beyond the simple podcast interview. And people sometimes ask me, well, Yann, how did you put together the Podcast Success Summit with 80 speakers? People are like, how did you do that? I'm like, you know what I did? The first thing I did, I seriously looked at the people who I interviewed and those who I clicked with, who I had a great time chatting with them. They had a great time chatting with me. And what happens when you do this is that if at some point you get an idea and you're like, you know what? Larry, it's a great guy, or Ray, it's a great guy. I had a great time interviewing him for my podcast. You know what? I want to promote my new course. I want to do joint webinars. You know what? I'm just going to send Ray an email or Larry an email, Magda an email, Dave, Christopher an email, and see if they would be interested in doing a joint webinar. So if you start to look at people to interview, not only because you want to have them on your show, but really you look for people who you may even do business with at some point. Things are going to change for you if you want to leverage your podcast as a business asset from the host perspective. All right, Christopher, you got it. So now I'm going to change. We have a few minutes here, so I'm going to change. Awesome, Larry. Great to read all these fantastic comments, guys. Thank you so much. I'm really having a great time, as I think you can see. And I'm going to change the focus of the conversation a bit and talk about approaching podcasts as a guest. And certain things you'll see are going to intersect with some of the things we've touched on. So if you want to be on podcasts, and this, by the way, could be you, even if you are here on International Podcast Day and you don't have a podcast, and you're like, well, I don't feel like going all the time through the process of interviewing or publishing episodes, it's fine. You can still get a lot of great things from podcasting by simply being somebody else's guest. So the first question obviously should be, okay, why do I want to be a podcast guest? Just leave your ego aside and think seriously, why do I want to be interviewed on podcasts? And there are different reasons. It could be, okay, because I would like to become an expert in this particular niche. So I would like to be interviewed by all podcasters whose shows cover that specific topic. Or maybe you say, well, okay, I would like to network with people who are in this specific country. So I'm going to look for shows where the hosts are in this specific country. Or perhaps you say, well, I have a book coming out, so I would like to share the message of the book. Why not promote the book as well? Or maybe you're a speaker or you would like to be a speaker and you're like, well, okay, I'm going to approach podcasting as a kind of training to become a better speaker. So every interview I do, I'm going to really make sure that not only I bring my A game, but also that maybe after the interview, I go back and listen to it and I'm like, okay, so I said, for example, too many times, or I wasn't really clear, or I could have had a better call to action and this kind of thing. So once you're clear with your goal, it's time to think about what podcasts would help you achieve that goal. And when I talk about the perfect podcast, it's not about the numbers. It's about being on the right podcast. And this is fascinating because when I wanted to promote the virtual summit I mentioned a moment ago, I went on a few podcasts, but I was the first to say to the host that, you know, if I were to simply come on your show and talk about how great my summit is and blah, 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 nobody cares. On the other hand, if we have a conversation on podcasting and then the virtual summit is the natural next step to our conversation, or the summit is a way for people to dive into the topic more in depth, then it makes perfect sense. And I was talking with my friend Jessica Rhodes. She hosts a podcast called Roads to Success, because we talked about this the other day, and I came up with the term the $500 call to action. Would you guys like me to share what that is, or should I keep that for myself? Me too, Christopher. Well, I see Larry says, please share. I see Ray says share. So I guess I'm going to share it. So basically, what happened there is that you asked that because you wanted to sip your vodka. You busted me. Actually, you know what? I changed. It's not vodka anymore. I changed. Now it's gasoline. So basically what we did there is we saw that after the interview with her, in the following 48 hours, I got 5 sales. And I made $500 by spending 33 minutes on her podcast. And one may think, well, okay, who cares? But here's the interesting part. We were talking about that the other day, and Jess looked at her stats, and she saw that that conversion happened when that interview itself had less than 100 downloads. So think about that for a second. It's not about the numbers. So the $500 call to action, here's the exact process. It's not about the numbers. It's about finding shows that they have listeners who are a match for your message, for your offer. It's not about going on a big show to boost your ego. And it's not about how many people they are tuning in, because podcasters or podcasts oftentimes are evergreen. So it's not about that. It's about being in front of the right audience. And that's where the 500, and first of all, having that, and then have a clear call to action. So I talked about that at the beginning of the session. If you're a podcast host, have a clear call to action. The same goes if you are a podcast guest. Have one clear call to action. Now, when it comes to being a podcast guest, there is one question that you should ask to every single podcaster who's about to interview you. Would you guys like to know that? Yes? No? Okay, Will says yes. Well, looks like Will is the only one who wants to know. Well, Ray said yes. Okay, I see a couple of people, so I'm gonna share that. The golden question you should really ask before you do any interview is, when you're on the call with the host, ask him or her, who is your audience? And you may think, oh, okay, Yann, that's so obvious. No, it's not obvious. And here's what I mean. The more information you get from the host before the podcast, the more you're able to make examples or to leverage storytelling and to touch on stories or bring up stories that are specific and that they resonate to the specific audience. Here's what I mean. If I want to be interviewed on entrepreneurial shows, great. But there are different types of entrepreneurs. So for example, if I usually talk about online business and I'm interviewed on a podcast that is for brick and mortar businesses, and I share all these great stories about online stuff, how is it going to resonate with me? If I'm listening, I have a podcast. If I'm listening, I have a business, but it's an offline business. So those things don't really resonate with me. So think about that. Think about how you can really get that information beforehand, so that among all the case studies you may have, the examples you may have, the anecdotes you may have, you're going to take out the ones that resonate with the right person. So for example, if I were to be interviewed on a podcast where the target audience are women entrepreneurs, me bringing up the example of Jessica Rhodes would be perfect, because she's a podcaster, she's a woman. But on the other hand, if I would bring up the example of a male podcaster who has a podcast about, I don't know, fashion for men, there may be a disconnect. So I know this has been a lot to cover here. It's been a lot of content, guys. I hope you have been enjoying it. And I see I have only a couple of minutes left. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to add one final component to this, And then I'm gonna leave you guys a couple of minutes to ask me any questions. Great, Will. Thanks for the shout out. Thanks, Christopher. So the final thing is, we've talked about this from the host perspective. So set up a system. If you want to be a guest on podcasts, do the same thing. So think about, okay, if I talk about blogging, what are the areas I often talk about? These areas. So create lead magnets for each, and then you could create awesome, Craig. You can create specific landing pages. So if you have 5 lead magnets, and again, it doesn't have to be 50, you can have 5. So one for building a blog, one for coming up with ideas, one for creating the content, one for marketing the content, one for, I don't know, making money from your blog, let's say. You create 5 landing pages. And again, think about something like Pretty Link so that the links you share are easy for people to remember. And at the end of every interview you do, you're going to invite people to take the next step and get your freebie, whether that's a PDF or it's a 30-day challenge. And then once they sign up, the know, like, and trust factor building, the lead nurturing process, is everything is going to be done on autopilot, and that's going to allow you to really have more time to focus on other things while you kind of providing people with more value, promoting your products, and inviting people to buy happens on autopilot. Craig, cost of virtual summit is too high. I have been informed over the last 2 years, and I think the cost of the summit is too high, so I have not bought in. Do you mean to buy, to attend, or to host a virtual summit, Craig? To attend. Well, I mean, that actually, Craig, I have something for you and for everybody. So I've covered a lot of ground here, but here's the thing. We have been, this has been a kind of, even though we have had the chat, so we have had the chance to interact, this has been me in front of a camera talking all the time. And there are some things that I would have liked to show you, visual things. I would have liked to have some slides to show you some great example of certain things. So I plan on hosting an online workshop completely for free that is gonna dive deeper into this topic, podcasts as a business asset. So if you're interested in that, it's gonna happen in October. I don't have a specific date yet. I'm gonna share a link here in the chat. So now, Will, you're also gonna see how you can learn more about me. So if you go to yannilunga.com/IPD, so that's YANNILUNGA.com/IPD. Sign up there, and you're going to be the first to know when that workshop happens, so that we can really dive deeper into this. I can provide you with actual examples where you can really see the things in action, and you can really ask me any questions you may have. And that's going to be really an online workshop. So it's really going to be an opportunity for us to work together. They already would be dope to learn all the way from Zimbabwe. And you see in the chat, next up is Uncovering Spanish Podcasting with Craig Wieland and Pilar Ori. Great, Will. Looking forward to seeing you. And if you have any questions, I mean, I'm on thousands of platforms for a degree in computer, master study in marketing. Awesome, Craig. I'm all over the place, but the best way to do that, to connect with me, please do sign up for the webinar, and I'm gonna definitely send you an email. And if you have any questions related to this presentation or to some of the things I've talked about here and how those could be applied to your own specific case, definitely reply to the email. You're going to get an automated email that says, thank you so much, with a funny picture, by the way. So don't be afraid to hit reply. I do reply to every email. I don't have any robot or assistant who takes care of my email. I like to connect with people on a one-on-one basis. So you see, Ray, what I not only I talk the talk, but I walk the walk. So if you guys have any more questions, hi, Jorge. Hola, Jorge. If you have any more questions, please do sign up, yannilunga.com/IPD, reply to the automated email, and then I'm going to get in touch. I want to say thank you so much. And guys, make sure to stick around, because up next we have my friend Craig Whelan. So make sure to stick around, guys. And Dave, really again, thank you so much to you, Steve, and the entire International Podcast Day community. Thank you, everybody who has been tuning in. Ray, Will, Pilar, Christopher, Magda, everybody. This has been a lot of fun. Thank you, guys.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Yann, for coming in, supporting again International Podcast Day 2016. That's 2 years in a row from you. So I'm sure we'll line something up for next year.
Boom.
Yeah, that's awesome. Good shirt, man. All right, man. Thank you so much, Yann. And we'll be back in a few minutes with our next session. Thank you.